Greetings, intrepid system failure listeners. Nate here with your weekly essay read, this one entitled Resurrected Gods, and subtitled How the Cult of Dionysus Shaped Christianity. But first, a little preamble. Death and rebirth are central themes of Christianity, both in its mythology, and the story of Jesus is about coming back from the dead, and in its actual history. Christianity resurrected dead and dying older traditions and carried them forward into the Middle Ages and beyond. Three major examples, all readily allegorized by death and rebirth, are debt forgiveness, astronomical cycles, and ego death. These are the three main layers of Christian source material. The experience of ego death feels precisely like a personal death and rebirth. That's why existing religions in the Mediterranean basin held God-eating ceremonies with psychedelic compounds like ergot to induce ego death, preceding the bread and the wine of the Christian Eucharist by thousands of years. The experience of ego death and rebirth found a perfect allegory in ancient stories of resurrected gods. And now, without further ado, here's Resurrected Gods. Psychedelic wine. During the 1st century AD, Dioscorides served as a physician in the Roman army. He wrote a comprehensive 5-volume pharmacopoeia listing the healing properties of every substance known to medicine at that time. He called it De Materia Medica, and the entire 5th volume is dedicated to wine. Dioscorides suggests mixing wine with ingredients like the highly hallucinogenic mandrake root. He carefully recommends a specific dosage of this poisonous compound that induces a visionary experience without killing the drinker. The fact that so much of his pharmacopoeia treats wine as a delivery system for other drugs vividly illustrates how the Greeks and Romans used wine. They drank for reasons other than merely its alcohol content. Another vivid illustration is the story of the death of Hephaestion, Alexander's best friend and possible lover. In observance of the Greek tradition, games were held in Hephaestion's honor. One of those games was a wine drinking contest. According to the Greek historian Diodorus, 41 additional people died from this drinking game. Something in their goblets was clearly much more deadly than just plain wine. Resurrected Gods. Alexander's mother, Olympias, was a priestess of the wine god Dionysus. In the Vatican Museum, there are so many mosaics and statues of Dionysus that, on a recent visit, our tour guide felt compelled to explain that Christianity sourced many of its traditions from pre-Christian predecessors. The title card of this essay shows a photo, taken by the author, of one among many examples of Dionysian iconography on display at the Apostolic Palace. Our tour guide was referring to the story of Dionysus's resurrection. He was a late addition to the Greek pantheon. The worship of Dionysus started much later than the mysteries of Eleusis, which anchored the religions of Greece and Rome for 1,000 years. However, Dionysus's mythology eventually merged with Eleusis', and he became the son of Zeus and Persephone. There are many variations to Dionysus' story. He was either accidentally killed by his father or torn apart by monsters. Zeus then brings him back to life by carrying his corpse within his own body. In this case, Dionysus was the only son physically begotten by Zeus. Or by having a mortal girl hold it in her womb until the resurrected Dionysus was eventually reborn. In this case, Dionysus was born of a virgin. The story of Jesus, of course, would later draw upon both variations. These resurrection narratives were of critical importance to the mystery religions of Greece, where Dionysus's death and rebirth served as a model for initiates' spiritual transformation. The Dionysian mysteries celebrated the cyclical nature of death and resurrection. Mourning for Dionysus' death and joyful celebration of his resurrection, wrote legendary historians Will and Ariel Durant, formed the basis of a ritual extremely widespread among the Greeks. In springtime, when the vine was bursting into blossom, Greek women went up into the hills to meet the reborn god. For 2 days, they drank without restraint. And, like our less religious Bacchanalians, considered him witless who would not lose his wits. Unquote. The Roman crackdown. The resurrection themes in Dionysian worship became increasingly important during the Hellenistic and the Roman periods, when mystery religions focused on personal salvation and immortality gained through divine association with the suffering, dying, and resurrected God. Just as at Eleusis, the Dionysian proceedings were dominated by women. Well, the drugs consumed at Eleusis were called kykion after the Homeric epics. The psychoactive wine consumed during the Dionysia was called pharmakon. Pharmakon could mean remedy, poison, or scapegoat, depending on the context. Instead of Dionysus, the Romans referred to the wine god as Bacchus. In 186 BC, the Roman government cracked down on the wildly popular Bacchic cult. The Roman historian Livy left us with a chilling account of its high priestess, Pacula Annia, and the execution of some 6,000 cultists. According to Livy, the cult functioned as a, quote, state within a state. Upstart religions are usually persecuted by existing authorities, who understandably get nervous when their subjects coalesce into functioning bodies external to established political systems. That's what Livy meant by suggesting the Bacchic cult functioned as a state within a state. Additionally, the experience of ego death significantly amplifies the political threat posed by new religions centered around psychoactive drugs. The ego is the mental conception of the self. It's how one knows which mouth to put food in at dinner. Ego death refers to the temporary dissolution of that conception, much in the way that nervousness about approaching someone at a bar is temporarily disabled by a shot of so-called liquid courage. The experience of ego death feels like a death in rebirth of the self. That's why resurrected gods became symbols for ego-dissolving drugs. The ego is the only handle by which the authorities can grab us. When people stop identifying as their physical bodies, they can no longer be threatened with prison, torture, or execution. Jesus was so confident that he was not his physical body that he consented to a gruesome public execution. The remarkable story of Christ, whether true in the literal sense or not, advertised the limitations of state power as Rome headed into her twilight. The Gospel of John. While wild grapes are native to Greece, organized viticulture and wine grapes were transplanted there by Semitic Phoenician traders. That's why the wine god Dionysus was portrayed as a foreigner who arrived from the east. Because the story of Christ was about a resurrected Jew who turned water into wine, it would have been familiar to the millions of Greeks living in the Roman Empire. They would have instantly understood the reference to ego-dissolving drugs. These drugs had to be alluded to indirectly because of the fraught legal situation surrounding them. After periods of intense persecution, such as the events of 186 BC, Roman authorities eventually adopted versions of Dionysus and Jesus that were acceptable to the state. But in both cases, the path from outlaw cult to state religion was scattered with bodies. The need for discretion explains why multiple resurrected wine gods haunted the Roman Empire. During the Dionysian festival, known as Thea, priests would place 3 empty bronze basins inside a building. The doors of the building were then sealed, with witnesses present. The following morning, the seals would be broken, and the basins would be found filled with wine. Jesus accomplishes this same feat of turning water into wine in the Gospel of John. The New Testament is a Greek story, written in Greek, but set in Palestine. In addition to borrowing the transformation of water into wine, John also used the language of Greek philosophy to portray Jesus as the embodiment of the Logos, a term used by Greeks to signify reason, divine order, and the principle that governs the universe. Logos is the Greek word for word, and it shows up in the first line of John. In the beginning was the Word. Before the ego-dissolving kykeon of Eleusis and pharmakon of Dionysus became the bread and wine of the Christian Eucharist, they impacted the Greek inventions of democracy, theater, and philosophy. One of history's greatest philosophers, Plato, was initiated into the mysteries of Eleusis. His experience there heavily informed his philosophy. And next week's essay will explore the effect of ego-dissolving drugs on Greek philosophy. So, if you'd like, head on over to systemfailure.org, where you can view this week's essay and the title card mentioned in it, and all of the supplemental further materials. You can also enter your email address to sign up for weekly Monday emails from me here at System Failure. And that way you won't have to worry about missing next week's exciting essay. Additionally, if you'd like to get in contact with either me or with Brian, you can accomplish that feat over at systemfailure.org. All right, well, that's it for this week's audio essay, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. We will see you back here with Brian on Monday for our regularly scheduled System Failure podcast. See you then, folks.